Buonasera.
Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Massimo Gaggi. I'm a journalist with the Corriere della Sera, and I've been working in the past 15 years from the United States for the Italian Daily. I was asked to coordinate this meeting with Professor Daron ACEMOGLU, who will speak to us from Boston. And in introducing him, I would like very briefly to talk about the world in which he works, and also of the topic that we are going to address. This year's festival is about the return of the state, and it is not that of considering the aspects of the conflict with the private entities, but rather focusing on possible cooperation between public and private entities. This might be or seem obvious to consider here in Europe, especially after the pandemic. It was more difficult to address this topic, though, years ago, in the years of absolute liberalism, and especially so in the United States, which, after the first decades after the World War, witnessed a certain development. There was a strong state intervention, and I think of Eisenhower's and also Nixon's policies. But then starting at the end of the 70s, the situation changed, and there was a lot of hostility in a way, and also mistrust vis-à-vis those policies. And I think of Reagan and President Reagan and his words of defining the state a problem and not a solution. Professor ACEMOGLU, and I will be very brief in terms of telling you about his biography. Of course, you find full details in the booklet of the festival. Anyway, Professor ACEMOGLU is an institute professor in America, born in Istanbul, of Armenian background, and after studying in London, he has taught for 30 years, especially at MIT in Boston. And Professor ACEMOGLU, over the past decades, has developed an economic thought and a theory that has been developed in hundreds of academic papers and in a number of very successful books on political aspects and political economic aspects. Already back in years when it was not so that everybody talked about this topic, and he has always stressed also the need to put constraints and limits to the market, so that we have a state with certain regulatory power. And this is something that he considered in his books, also books for the general public, not only in his academic papers. And I would like to mention the fact that in 2006 he focused about the economic origins of dictatorships, and there specifically he focused on the need to have a strong role of civil society as the basis for democracy. And then Why Nations Fail, written with Mr. Robinson, published in Italy with the title Perché le nazioni falliscono. Well, in that book he explained in a very significant way, I believe, the fact that there might be a need for disruption, creative disruption, as we call it, which is so important in technology, which is important in order to renew society and technology, and that is also conducive to the development of economy. And that works only if there is a strong presence of the state, which has to be solid, well-defined, and transparent and certain as well. So, as I said, he addressed all these topics and put forward his opinions in years when it was not easy to do so. And I think of Reagan and then also other presidents. And I think then of what happened with the presidency of Mr. Clinton and Obama, who also paid a lot of attention to the development of the market. We have had many changes over the course of time. Of course, in Professor ACEMOGLU's thought, all this has to be clearly balanced. You need to have rules, of course, without creating too many constraints to the development of creativity, because you see, in his thought, he makes it very clear that the increase in wealth and income derive from the development of market activities. So you need to create a welfare system, public services, and help using at best the tools and instruments of civil society within the framework of a dynamic approach, which is, of course, an economic dynamic approach. This is especially what we find in the Narrow Corridor book, and the title has been directly translated into Italian in a very explanatory way. Again, we talk about a narrow corridor, which means that you need to strike the right balance in a narrow space, which, of course, requires government and administrations to be highly skilled and competent, especially in a time and at a time of technological development. Over the very past years, something happened that altered, in a way, the economic and political equations that we have. There are three factors that I would like to mention. First and foremost, the technology revolutions, starting with the development of artificial intelligence, that is giving us huge opportunities. And I also think in terms of development of the vaccines that we now have at our disposal, which has been made possible by the technology development. And I think of Moderna's and Pfizer vaccines especially. But of course, these technologies change and in a way also upset the labor market, and also create monopolies and oligopolies in the economy, in the economic system, and then inequalities in terms of economic inequalities. And Professor ACEMOGLU has always focused on that topic. You see, inequalities over the past years have increased incredibly, and the third factor is the pandemic, which in a way deteriorated the situation further, meaning that it has exacerbated the speed of automation and the introduction of automatic technologic processes, and also increased inequalities. But this also created an opportunity, which is that of having the opportunity to start from scratch, in a way, with plans to construct and reconstruct, which are similar to what we had after the World War, so that you can start reconstructing again from scratch. I would like to mention a paper he wrote very recently about these specific aspects and the need to redesign artificial intelligence in order to give back civil society and politics and politicians as well the capability not only to govern but also to keep the development of technologies within the realm of a social usefulness approach, so to say, where the human factor is very important still, without leaving everything in the hands of a limited number of people who can be extremely ingenious in terms of what they can develop from the viewpoint of technology, but which of course have an interest in maintaining power in their own sector. And on the other hand, there is also the need to increase the capability of influencing positively political and social movements and elements. Certainly, there are many questions that we might ask, but we don't have so much time. So I stop here and I give him the floor. And I published an interview with Professor ACEMOGLU in the Corriere della Sera today, so you can also read there his contributions. But of course, we hope to have time for questions also at the end of the contribution. And now, Professor ACEMOGLU, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Massimo. It's my pleasure to be here, remotely albeit. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm going to try to speak for about half hour so that we have time for Q&A at the end, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. I'm going to talk about the crises, plural, engulfing the world, especially the Western world. But to do that, I'm going to start from the book that James Robinson and I published in 2019, The Narrow Corridor. We take a critical aspect of society to be its ability to support liberty. But our notion of liberty here is not the narrow one, like being let alone by the state. It's more similar to what Republican philosophers such as Philip Pettit, neo-Republican, define as dominance, or the opposite of dominance. Dominance is a situation in which somebody has arbitrary power over you. That could be somebody outside of your family, inside of your family, your employer, groups, or institutions. If you are living at the mercy of another, in a situation that you are vulnerable to harm from them or threat of harm, that undermines liberty. So you can see that liberty requires many key elements of society that most of us, not just in Western modern societies, but throughout history, most of us find highly critical. Security, safety, autonomy, and capabilities. So you cannot have liberty if there is a great degree of inequality so that I'm in a subservient situation. And liberty, when you look at it this way, is intimately linked with democracy. You cannot have liberty in a situation like China, where the Communist Party is supreme and whatever it decrees becomes law. And you cannot have democracy or liberty in situations in which there is absolutely no law that rules the lives of most people. Now, I think one way of understanding where we are at the moment is to look at how in recent past people have thought about this. So there were many predictions related to this. For example, in the days following the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote the End of History essay and book in which he predicted an unabashed victory of political and economic liberalism. And indeed, in the 1990s, we had many more countries become either democracies or improve the depth of their democracies. But these predictions haven't fared very well. Here, I'm showing data from one of the international organizations, the Freedom House, that tracks democracy. And what you see is that way before the pandemic, since 2006, in every year, the number of countries that have gone back in democracy, either big declines or small declines, so be it, that has significantly exceeded the number of countries that have improved their democracy score. So democracy is not faring well. We don't know exactly why. There's a debate on this, but it's not faring really well. But perhaps then we should go to another set of predictions. Just a few years after Fukuyama, political international scholar Robert Kaplan predicted the opposite, that in some sense violence would spread throughout the world. Coming of anarchy, he called it. This was a modern version of Thomas Hobbes's poor, nasty, and British and short lives, because a powerful Leviathan would increasingly become unable to keep up with the demands of an international world, especially with many pockets of lawlessness. Well, in the decade before the pandemic, you might have thought this was actually more likely to come true. So these are scenes from Syria and Raqqa after the carnage that the Islamic State wreaked when they took over. Similar situation in Iraq, Mosul. This is again under the rule of the Islamic State. It looks certainly scenes from a different age than the one we are used to. And perhaps most symbolically, and capturing really what Thomas Hobbes had, the prelude to all of this was a complete collapse of the state institutions. These are the helmets of Iraqi soldiers. They left it behind as they were fleeing Islamic State, a complete collapse of the law structure. But even though the situation in Syria and parts of Libya, Mali, have not much improved, Kaplan's predictions have not come true either. In fact, we have seen a very, very different process in which the nature of the state-society relations have changed, much more in line with the sort of the picture I showed you of the retreat of democracy. So in that context, the Israeli scholar Yuval Noah Harari has made another prediction. Perhaps what we're going to have is a digital dictatorship. You can recognize this in the spirit of new technologies, AI, but other digital technologies as well, strengthening the hands of the state. In the nature of Marx's famous quote, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. And in some sense, you can think of Harari and others saying AI and social media give you society with the digital big brother. And again, if you want to think about the world in these ways, you can do so. This is Tiananmen Square with face recognition cameras. Certainly no mass demonstration there over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Tiananmen Square protests in a bloody massacre. And the local and central government in China have made tremendous strides, and now not much media coverage of this topic, but tremendous strides towards setting up social credit system where every dimension of an individual life is now being monitored by either corporations or, more worryingly, by the state. And of course, the coronavirus has complicated all of these processes. It has accelerated some of these trends. Many of the worst authoritarian governments, Putin, Modi, Erdogan in Turkey, as well as China, have used this as an excuse for tightening the grips, completely killing any semblance of free discourse. Not that much free media was left in these countries anyway. And many are thinking that this is the end of democracy, liberty, perhaps globalization. In fact, the problems don't end there. It wasn't just that the economy was highly inclusive, using the language that James and I used, and growth was fast, and the only problem was this struggle over liberty and democracy. In fact, much of the West was suffering in the hands of a increasing grip, tightening grip of inequality. Here, let me show you a few more slides to motivate it before I come to the conceptual framework that I'm going to use for thinking about these issues. This is real wages in the US for men with different education levels, from red, high school dropouts, all the way to blue, high school workers with postgraduate degrees. And what you see is that in the 60s, and the same is true in the 50s and 70s, you have the period of rising tide lifting all boats. All these groups are experiencing pretty similar growth in their real wages, about 2.5% a year in real terms. But then, since then, a completely different picture, a huge increase in inequality. These red and the blue curves are going in different directions. Very lackluster wage growth for most people. Even college graduates who don't have postgraduate specialized degrees, the light blue in the middle, doesn't show much real wage growth. It's really remarkable. We think of the importance of college degree in the US, in the UK, but workers with college degree aren't doing that well. It's only these postgraduate workers who are growing. And significant wage declines for workers with high school degree, Orange, or high school without a high school degree, even those with 2-year degree. A very, very different labor market. Even worse, this has been associated with the collapse of the middle class occupations. So if you look at what's constituted the backbone of the middle class during the 50s and the 60s, it was these occupations I'm showing in yellow and dark orange, yellow and light brown. Production workers, assembly line workers, blue-collar workers, clerical workers, administrative workers, and sales workers. Both among college and non-college workers, those engaged in these middle-class occupations has tremendously declined. In the 80s, even more in the 1990s, and continuing in the 2000s. Even worse, while among college workers you've had some of those jobs being replaced by higher quality professional, technical, and managerial jobs, among non-college workers, these top occupations are not growing. It's all at the bottom. So we're creating a very polarized job market in which very little wage growth and very little middle-class jobs available for workers with no college, and even for workers with colleges getting worse. This is the US. But these issues are not just a US phenomenon. Inequality has been increasing everywhere in Europe. Sure, the bottom of the wage distribution falling up, falling down, falling apart, that's a US phenomenon because US does not have decent levels of minimum wages or labor market institutions, but the overall inequality is true everywhere. Sweden, Germany, Italy, UK, US started more unequal and has become more unequal, but it's very similar if you look at the Gini coefficient to many countries. Even more tellingly, the middle class going in south, disappearing, is also true throughout the developed world. So here I'm showing you how the same occupations, the middle third of the wage of the occupation distribution has changed in pretty much every country in Europe as well as the US, and you see that these red bars are all negative, meaning that these jobs have been disappearing everywhere. So we have political, social, and economic challenges. Where is the future going to be? A dismal one? Growing inequality, few people having decent jobs, the rest either jobless or living on transfers. At the same time, liberty, freedom, freedom of expression, and democracy falling foul of the powerful states, be they Chinese, American, or European? Well, not nearly, perhaps not. It may be that there are these tremendously challenging forces, but how they will affect the future, how they will affect liberty, state, inequality, pandemics, will depend on how we use that technology. But to be able to talk about these issues, we need a framework. Well, the framework I'm going to talk about is a new one, but in some sense it's the same issues that people ever since they have been interacting with the state have been struggling with. The first surviving writing is from the Sumerian tablets from almost 4,500 years ago. They tell the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. The Gilgamesh, the Sumerian tablets start by describing what a wonderful society, city, Gilgamesh had created. How its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. Palm trees, the gardens, the orchards, the glorious palaces, and the temples. It looks like a happy society in the ancient world. But not so fast. Fly in the ointment. There's a problem of despotism, the same sort of issue that I was talking about, threatening liberty, democracy. The tablets continue. They say, who is like Gilgamesh? What other king has inspired such awe? Who else can say, I alone rule supreme? His head raised high, trampling its citizens like a wild bull. He's king. He does whatever he wants. takes the son from his farmer, crushes him, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. No one dares to oppose him. So if you go back to my definition of liberty from Philip Pettit's notion of dominance, you'll see this is crushing liberty. It's a complete dominance. Gilgamesh is like a wild bull, does whatever he wants. His arbitrary power is supreme. Well, the tablets continue. Citizens are not happy. They are not happy with just gleaming, glorious buildings and ramparts. They want freedom. So they cry to the heavens, to the god of the sky, Anu. They ask her to stop this despotism. Anu comes up with a solution to contain Gilgamesh. It is the first example in history of checks and balances. Create a double for Gilgamesh, his second self, a man who equals his strength and courage, a man who equals his stormy heart. So Enkidu, Gilgamesh's double, is created. When Gilgamesh is about to rape a bride, Enkidu intervenes, the two fight, and perhaps that is the end of Gilgamesh's despotism. This would be very symbolic for many European countries, and Americans especially, who believe in checks and balances, separation of powers, constitutions. But actually this doppelganger solution is impractical. Who will control Enkidu? What if they will have to fight all the time when one of them wants to do something and the other one disagrees? And in fact, it doesn't work out. A few tablets later, now Enkidu and Gilgamesh team up and they start terrorizing everybody. So in fact, it isn't in the doppelganger collusions or the checks and balances that we have to look for the origins of liberty. What we have to create is a more organic set of shackles on the Leviathan. This is the essence of what Jim and I call shackled Leviathan. It has to come from society itself, from the mobilization of society. I think this is at once more difficult, but also more hopeful. Here is the conceptual lenses via which we look at this situation. Simplify everything to two variables, capacity of the state and the elite. This is where Gilgamesh was. High capacity to do stuff, like nice buildings and cobblestones, but also repress people. And the power of society to organize, solve the collective action problem, protest, if it's institutionalized, vote, and participate in assemblies. Most pre-modern societies were here. States were weak. You did not have rule of law or anything like that. And it was very difficult for hierarchy to emerge. They were deeply egalitarian countries, societies. But even more common today are these despotic leviathans, like China. Very powerful states, but at the same time they extinguish liberty by weakening, impairing civil society. But things are a little bit more hopeful, because when state and society are in balance, then you are in this narrow corridor. It is in this narrow corridor that you see a very different pattern. So now these arrows show that it's not like in the despotic Leviathan case where the state gets stronger and weakens society. The two can get stronger at the same time. This is what we call the Red Queen dynamic. State and society running together in competition, sometimes in cooperation. It's not an easy process. Some societies like the US have been in the corridor for most of their existence, but in a very powerful, in a very painful way. They've had many problems, many times come close to leaving the corridor. Other societies have left it, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but it emphasizes that it's a process to develop the institutional foundations of liberty, inclusive economies, democracy. But interestingly, if you believe this framework, it suggests that ultimately, even though this is difficult, uncertain, treacherous even, if you succeed in remaining in the corridor, the level of state capacity exceeds quite a bit what you can achieve even with the best despotic leviathans like China. Because you really need this competition and cooperation from society for information, for working with the state, for not undermining the state, for not withdrawing from the state, for the state capacity to build and to be exercised. But a theme that I'm going to emphasize throughout the rest of my talk, these are all choices. None of this is preordained. This figure suggests there are historical processes that are at work. If you start here, you are more likely to remain in the corridor, but there is no guarantee you can weir out as well. If you start here, you're more likely to go this way, but you can engineer a change and go into the corridor. So these are the choices. Now, one question is, if the Leviathan is so bad as I've said it, it crushes things, like Gilgamesh. It is important to control it. But there's another choice. Why remain without the Leviathan? That actually tells us a few things. It's useful to understand it. And the best way of understanding it is to actually look at one society that anthropologists have studied a lot, the Tiv, in this Tivland here in part of Nigeria, which was a long-established stateless society at the time Europeans came into contact with them, and a husband and wife team of anthropologists, Paul and Laura Bahanon, went and lived with them and wrote some papers by themselves and jointly describing the Tiv. The key about the Tiv that we now know applied to many of these societies is that they were highly egalitarian. But this egalitarian wasn't just economic. In fact, they didn't care so much about the economy. It was political. They did not want some people in society to end up with too much power and start bossing others. So again, this notion of dominance that I emphasize. In fact, they had such elaborate systems. They banned certain types of goods from being traded. They had political structures that discouraged hierarchy. They even had this various witchcraft beliefs that were, in essence, ways of stripping people who were becoming too powerful. It's the distrust of power that's at the root of the witchcraft, it says. It gives rise to the greater political institutions, the one based on the lineage system and the principle of egalitarianism. That's the way that they functioned. But the way that they functioned also implied that political hierarchy and together with it, state institutions never formed. But that's not the only way of dealing with the fear of despotic Leviathan and fear of loss of liberty. One of the first examples of democratic societies, Athens in ancient Greece, now more than 2,700 years ago, also grappled with the same issues. In fact, if you look at the surviving knowledge about this society, you see that they had a similar fear of the elites becoming powerful and dominating everything, just like the Tiv. But they had a very different way of dealing with it. They built institutions. They built laws and norms to contain very powerful people. One of those that's telling, not the only one, and that's the most important one, but it's emblematic, is the ostracism law. Under Cleisthenes, they passed a law in which every year the Athenian assembly, and they had an elected assembly, a democratic assembly, would vote whether there should be an ostracism. And if there was an ostracism, every Athenian citizen would write the name of a person on a piece of broken shard, which they called ostrakon, has the word ostracism, and whosever name was written most would be banished, exiled from the city. Here is one of the surviving shards with the name of Themistocles written on it. Themistocles was the closest that Athens had to a hero. He single-handedly built the Athenian navy, then led it against the Persians, and then identified the Spartan threat ahead of everybody else. Why would the Athenians banish him? Because at some point they thought he was getting too big for his boots. He was becoming too influential. Better to get rid of him than put up with him. So he was exiled for 10 years. So this institutionalized suspicion of power is very important. And it is the essence of what I emphasize, the Red Queen effect. Why the power of the state really grows bigger inside the corridor. Contested power is greater power. But is that the only factor? What about other social scientists who've thought about strong states? After all, dealing with things like the pandemic, inequality, international security threats, migration, we need strong states. Well, actually, when you look at history of thought, it's full of different theories of what makes strong states. Some of them, just like Marx, I pointed out, emphasize technology. Others, geographies. Others, types of crops. Perhaps the most important one in social science is the threat of war that's associated with Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly argued that modern states, especially capable states, come from war. In a very pithy way, he said, states made war and war made the state. Is that right? Is that something we have to learn from? Yes, it is something we have to learn from, but not because it's right, because it shows one way of thinking, and I want to emphasize a different way of thinking. And I want to use against this figure to show it. And imagine now I try to make sense of Tilly's point. I think what Tilly is saying is that, or one way of thinking of what Tilly is saying, is that when you have to deal with international war, you need a strong state to field an army, to tax and organize things, to construct supply chains, requisition lines. That can push you into the corridor. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to Switzerland. Starting from lawless, custom, tradition-based cantons, they formed a confederation and became one of the strongest states in Europe. And the reason they did that is because they were worried about the Holy Roman Empire being more aggressive and invading the cantons. So that's an example that the need to build state institutions increases the power of the state, and that pushes you into the corridor. That would be an example of what I pointed out, Tilly-esque or other ideas that are based on structural factors. But this framework immediately says, well, but there is no necessity, there are choices. Montenegro also fought the Ottomans all the time, but they started with such clan-based, such weak institutions, just like the TIV, that they never moved into the corridor. The impetus wasn't strong enough. Or Prussia. It started with fairly elaborate assemblies and parliaments, but at the time of right after the 30 Years' War, King Frederick William I thought, well, I want to have a bigger state, stronger state, so that I don't fall prey to wars like the 30 Years' War. And so he completely changed society, but in the process, he destroyed the narrow corridor for Prussia. As a result, in the words of Voltaire, we came to a situation in Prussia where other states have an army in Prussia, and the army has a state of its own. It became a completely militarized state outside of the corridor, moving in a despotic direction. And the reason why I'm going through this is not because I want to talk about Tilly's ideas, those are interesting, but about something more importantly. What I want to argue is that actually it's not these impulses, but it's the context in which these impulses are realized and the choices that we make in those contexts. So what matters is, first of all, whether we have the institutional means and economic organization to create a broad corridor. If you have a narrow corridor, and many societies that were based on a coercion, for example, had a narrow corridor, it's very difficult to get into it. It's very easy to get out of it. If you have a wide corridor, it's more easy to get into it, and you have more room for maneuver, which shocks polarization and difficulties inside the corridor. So more important than the impulses, it's how we manage those impulses. And even more important than the width of the corridor, I would say, are the choices that we make. And the choices are really critical in today's context, because today's challenges are very deep and wide-ranging. We have to claim power back from the states and corporations. The surveillance capacity that Hariri talks about, I think, is very important. Many others have pointed out, but I think it's incomplete if you just think of the states. Google knows much more about you than the Russian state or the Chinese states right now. To rein in inequality. But that is impossible, as Massimo said, without redirecting technological change. We cannot have broad-based prosperity if technology goes more and more in the direction of automation displacing workers. That's why all those middle-class jobs are disappearing, because robots, numerically controlled machinery, increasingly AI is taking those jobs away. But you cannot create anything but a two-tiered society unless you reverse that. That means redirecting technological change. All of these become important much more central in the age of COVID, which has accelerated these changes. Just like this picture that shows that a vertical move here does not put you inside the corridor or outside the corridor. It's a choice. It depends on where you are. The same applies of the role of new technologies, shocks like COVID. We have a variety of choices, how we're going to use them. But when it comes to those choices, and I will conclude, this is my last two slides, I think the critical thing is to create a much better welfare state. Why? Because the level of inequality, the level of uncertainty created by globalization, new technologies, cannot be handled without a robust welfare state. But it has to be a better welfare state, not the one like the one in Italy or France. A much more strong but also rational welfare state. And it must also do something else, as I've pointed out. At the center must be regulation of technology. So the state must have a say in whether new technologies are going to increase the power of corporations, automation, displacement of workers. But you see, there are lots of problems here. A bigger state, a more powerful state, a state now that says things about technology when we have a history of states sometimes blocking new technologies and causing poverty. What about new totalitarianism? That's exactly what Friedrich Hayek, one of the greatest social scientists of the 20th century, worried about when, as a recent emigre, he came across the Beveridge Report in 1942. This was the document emblematic of the rise of the social welfare state, which Lord Beveridge was chairing. It came in the middle of the war, and it was implemented right away, and then much more comprehensively by the first Labour government after the war. And one of the ministers of that government, James Griffith, said, one of the darkest hours of the war, the Beveridge Report fell like manna from heaven. But Hayek disagreed because he thought this would be just a different type of totalitarianism. He said this means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So essentially, in terms of my framework, he's saying, well, we're going to destroy liberty because the state is becoming more powerful and more interventionist. But at the end, Hayek was not right. In many places, actually, even before Hayek wrote, in Sweden, once the Workers' Party came to power in 1932, you saw an alternative path of the state's strengthening. As the state got stronger, a broader coalition in society formed. In Sweden, for example, it was workers, farmers, and business community that at the same time made democracy function better, democracy deeper. So I think moving forward, we have to find a way of increasing the power of the state in a way that is consistent with deepening of democracy. The state and society have to come together at a stronger level. It's not cooperation, it's both cooperation and competition. It's the Red Queen effect. And critical for this is a recognition of the new exigencies, new challenges, not shy away from the greater responsibilities of the state, but at the same time recognize that state left to its own devices would become despotic. So we have to deepen democracy, and throughout we have to keep this balance of power between state and society, between different groups in society, between left and right, balance of power rather than polarization. Okay, I will stop now, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daron. I understand you have the translation in Italian, so I'll continue to speak in Italian. And a questo punto io ho
Now, I have a series of questions, of course, that I would like to ask, but if possible, I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience so that they have the opportunity to ask questions if they wish to do so. Please tell your name, say who you are.
Sono studente, mi chiamo Alberto e faccio anche il giornalista e lavoro a un sito economico.
Alberto.
Quindi volevo chiedere,
I would like to ask the professor, do you think that the return of the state in the economy will continue with good results over the next few years? Or do you think that the return of the state will be limited just to this period of pandemics? Thank you.
I think history suggests that once the taxation capacity and some of the responsibilities of the state are increased, such as infrastructure investment, education, and health, they are very difficult to reverse. That doesn't imply, however, that the state will be more powerful in a good way. It could happen in a bad way. That's essentially what happened in some of the worst cases of state interventions. The state gets bigger, and then there's more loot for people to share among themselves. You see that, for example, in Venezuela. The state increased tremendously, but it really didn't help with poverty. It became more and more of a criminal state under Chavez and then worse under Maduro. So the question is, can we have the increase of the state's responsibilities go in the right direction, go into the right places? I don't think that, jacking up unemployment benefits is the main thing we need to do in the future. I think unemployment benefits are very important. That's what the US has done as a short-term fix. That's what many European countries have done. But much more, we need a more adaptable social welfare state. But also we need to have the state be engaged in ways that create jobs and earning potential for workers of different backgrounds. And of course, this is a much harder thing. We know in Italy, for example, a huge failure of state institutions, not just in the South, although South is telling, many of the state programs turn into patronage tools. So we have to find ways of battling that if we want to build a better social safety net and a better state intervention mechanism. So I think the glass is half full. I think there is an opportunity. There is a greater openness for some of these things. I think taxes are going to increase as fraction of GDP everywhere within Europe. But how we're going to use that, I'm not sure that we can be optimistic. I think we can be cognizant that there are some good opportunities there. Whether we're going to be able to grasp them, that's the question.
Faccio una domanda.
I have a question for Daron. Well, in Italy, like in the US, there is a certain good attitude and a positive surprise about what Biden is doing. There were not so many expectations for him. In 2008, Professor ACEMOGLU criticized some interventions implemented by Bush and then Obama during the financial emergency. And there have been interventions also by Biden in this period. When I interviewed him for the Corriere della Sera, I had the impression that you are a bit critical about the policies of President Biden. So can you tell us more? Why do you think that Biden's actions or initiatives are insufficient? Can you tell us something about that?
I think we have to put into perspective. I actually think that Biden's policies are much better than the Bush and Obama policies. They both inherited, well, actually, Obama and Biden, let's say, inherited a deep economic crisis. They both needed to take some actions. But Obama explicitly targeted the biggest banks and bailed the banks out and didn't do anything for the regular people, by and large. The theory was, if the banks function, then there will be trickle down for the rest of society. It wasn't completely wrong. The economy came out of recession, but it came out of the recession in a very slow and very, very, very unequal way, and the criminal behavior of many bankers was completely condoned. supported rather than being punished. I think Biden is doing something much more direct, trying to help people with the infrastructure plan, with the fiscal plan. Some of the details we can debate. For example, do we need such long unemployment benefits versus other ways of spending the money on education, technology, jobs? But my main criticism would be that the real challenge moving forward is really one of creating jobs for the middle class. And there, I think the Biden administration has not stepped up to the plate and confronted that challenge yet. So I think the big agenda of regulation of technology, dealing with AI, automation, finding new ways of structuring incentives for businesses so that they invest in workers, not in machines to replace workers. Those are not on the agenda yet. So I am quite pleasantly surprised about the activism of the Biden administration, but I think more is needed.
Un'ultima domanda.
A very last question, because we have to close because of COVID restrictions, we cannot go further. So a very final question about the role of the civil society, above all in the US. Well, it is a bit more of a question for a sociologist, for a social scientist, but could you tell us something? Are you pessimistic or optimistic about the possibility for the civil society in the US to emerge again after a period of fights, extremism?
No, I think it's very difficult to be optimistic. I did not have time to talk about this, but in the book we devote a full chapter to how societies leave the corridor. We talk, for example, of how Italian city-states collapsed. And in all of these cases, polarization is a handmaiden of collapse of the corridor. And today, United States, and there are some signs of the same thing in Europe as well, but the US has become hugely polarized. Different political groups, left and right, Trump supporters versus non-Trump supporters, they're in their political bubbles. And that's very, very dangerous. On the other hand, if you want to look at the glass as quarter full rather than all empty, if you look at the concerns of the left and right, there are a lot of points of overlap. So if you go, wonderful books like, for example, by the sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, who goes to, communities that are big supporters of Trump, and their concerns are jobs, low wages, collapsing occupations and economic opportunities. There's a lot of overlap between their concerns and those of the left. But the solutions they come up are very different. And there is a complete climate of distrust of the other group. And I think President Trump, now fortunately President Trump, made things much worse, and he's continuing to make things much worse. But if we can break Trump and this extremist entrepreneurs' grip over the Republican voters who are also dissatisfied by the same things, I think there are a lot of points of overlap. At the end, the New Deal came from FDR, but it was embraced by the whole society. So the question is that possible today? I'm not going to say that it is possible, but I'm not saying that it's impossible either.
In the interview the other day, you made reference to environmental actions. We're a bit behind, lagging behind in terms of climate actions, but there is a political consensus among companies which are reducing their environmental footprint, for example. And also single citizens are becoming more environmental friendly, so to say. So also within polarized societies, in the end, there can be a corridor which goes towards a certain change. Do you think that this is possible also in the area of technology? And so that,
you know, even on climate, if you look at the Republican voters, they are becoming much more climate conscious, especially about young Republican voters. But then, you know, again, you add Trump, you add other merchants of extremism like Fox News or the radio show hosts, and as soon as they have their effects, then the conversation completely changes. So I think this is where political coalition building and building bridges, building trust becomes quite important. But yes, I think technology and climate are two of the most urgent challenges. In both of them, there are very similar solutions. We have to redirect technological change in both of them. We're not going to solve the climate problem by, you know, crazy geoengineering schemes or by cutting production in around the world by 20%. We have to find ways of creating clean energy. That's a technological problem, and that's a technological process. Same thing in the area of jobs. We have to find ways of finding human technology problems. And the more we have these debates, the more the debates cease to be partisan but become informative, I think the more new paths are open to us.
Daron, grazie infinite, siamo perfettamente di tempi.
Thank you so much. We are well in time. Thank you so much to the audience, and hopefully we will see you in person next year. Thank you.